the part 3 video cut off rather abruptly because I'd run out of time. I had to go back and trim some of it off to get it under 15 minutes. So here we are in the sod house in springtime or whatever, and insects are breeding in very large numbers. So, you know, and we have all this documentation from people who were there, mainly women writing letters home to their relatives. And they're crawling in and out of your clothes, out of the food. You wake up with them crawling out of your mouth. And I guess it's just something you have to put up with. The price of living in a dirt house. Now, actually, there may be people who opt to live in dirt houses now because they're very inexpensive and easy to heat and cool. And I posted an extra video about that. I was rather surprised about that. So I'm started putting things up there that I can find on YouTube. It's just a selection. You go there and you might see more stuff you're interested in. But I think that that's something you take advantage of just to make things seem more real, give you some visual cues on this. Okay, other problems that they had. There are two that are about side by side. I'm going to say next, inadequate amounts of land. Okay, these people are, unless they're buying land from the railroads, and I don't know how much they could buy there, but if you're homesteading it, that means you could claim land and occupy and develop it, live on it for a few years, and it is yours. That started with the Homestead Act of 1862, which, by the way, if I'm not misinformed, is still on the books. So I guess you could still homestead the public domain if you don't mind being 60 miles from the nearest utility hookup, and that might appeal to some people. But it's 160 acres. Now, back east, that's a lot. Out in the Great Plains, it's not really very much at all because what you're dealing in here are high volume crops that have a very low profit margin. Okay, wheat, corn, whatever it is, and you can't produce enough to really do well financially with a very narrow profit margin. You have to have a much larger operation than that. So that was one reason people would quit and leave. And some of the survivors who hung tough would buy out the claims of their neighbors who were leaving, and they would end up with much larger operations. This is as good a time as any to put in the fact that, as I put it in the supplements, there were sharks in the waters, metaphorically speaking. There were really large agribusiness operations of 1,000 or more acres. The land probably obtained by bending the rules somehow. But a farm of 1,000 or more acres, and there were some way bigger than that, they were called bonanza farms. So with an operation that size, you could afford high volume harvesting equipment. You could afford steam-powered tractors that cost almost as much as a train locomotive. You could hire armies of seasonal workers to harvest the crop. You could translate a low per unit profit margin into a really large amount of money. That's going to be the pattern. That's the pattern of agriculture out there now. So inadequate amounts of land. Here's another one. By the way, you had your 160 acres, and guess what? You're always also raising your own food on part of that. And you're pasturing your horses. I doubt that you do that. There's a lot of other federal land around. But anyway, there are other uses. You can't use all of it. There's no Kroger. Okay, another one is inadequate rainfall. Now, these are farmers from back east where rains fell most years in plentiful quantity enough to irrigate the soil. Now, among the imaginary lines on the maps, there are sometimes called meridians. They're numbered. They run from the North to South Pole. And the 100th meridian, which runs not too far from where we are now, we're a little bit east of it. Below that, by sheer coincidence, average annual rainfall fell below 30 inches a year on average. All right? 30 inches is reckoned to be pretty much the minimum that it takes if you're depending on the rain to irrigate your crops. Now, west of that, most years there really won't be enough. Now, there was a self-styled agricultural expert who went around giving seminars for farmers on what he called dry land farming techniques. And his recommendation was that every time it even sprinkles, you get out there as fast as you can and turn the soil on top under. That's supposed to retard evaporation, conserve the moisture, and he thought and recommended you do that religiously. You ought to be able to bring in a crop about 6 years out of 7. He was wrong, although we do have dry land farmers. Maybe they do it some different way. So many people tried it, many people failed. So inadequate amounts of rain. Now, what will happen eventually, since there's a lot of water down below the ground, the invention of the windmills become common. That's going to open up whole new possibilities. Let's see. Now, this next thing, I'm not saying it happened all the time. This didn't, maybe 2 or 3 times, because we don't have records of them very often. But the farmers called them locust plagues, where large insects would come just clouds of them would swoop in numbers large enough to darken the sun, they said. That doesn't necessarily mean it would look like midnight at 1 p.m., just enough to use a photography term to take it down an f-stop or 2. It was impressive. They're going to consume every bit of plant life. It's not like your draft horse is going to be reduced to skeletal remains, but one farmer complained that they ate everything but the mortgage. And you're done. You have to start all over. So what were these locusts? People had read about locust plagues in the book of Exodus in the Bible, so they gave that name to this. We don't know for sure, but the best guess is grasshoppers. Grasshoppers thrive in distressed soil. So you have that. And long term, these people don't know that much yet about contour plowing, okay? And they're going from native range grasses to what they call a monoculture, where there's just one type of plant at a time. That's going to loosen the topsoil, and the wind gets up, it's going to blow away. So there were sandstorms, and during a drought there'd be terrible sandstorms. This goes on as late as the wrong century, occupational hazard, 1950s. Okay, I happen to have lived my first 6 or 7 years in Dawson County, Texas. That's above the Cap Rock. It's on the Llano Estacado. It's flat out there, and it was in the drought of the 50s. And I remember these sandstorms. I can tell you, sand has a smell. It does. Gets into everything. I was in first grade one time, and there's a window. You can look out the window, and not more than 20 feet away, there's a slide on a playground. You could barely tell where it was. Sandstorms. All right, the topsoil ends up down the Gulf of Mexico. So the fact is, with all these problems, and I don't know if this isn't what I left out a while ago. You know what? It was isolation. If I mentioned isolation, fascinating, I want to do it again. This is a situation that gradually gets better year by year as more people move in. But for the first few years, if you're one of the first settlers in an area, there's no neighbors around, probably. And there's a whole bunch of problems connected with that. Okay, isolation. You're out there by yourself. Basically, everything's fine until there's a problem of some kind, and then you have to fix it because there's no help. Okay? If your kids get sick, you got to be a doctor. If your husband breaks his leg, farm wife, you're going to have to figure a way to set it. If a stranger approaches and you could see somebody coming a long way off and tell whether you know him or not, what would you do? Well, someone says, well, shoot him. That might be premature. He might be coming to invite you to Sunday school or something, or say you something. But you got your firearm ready and loaded, because if he means you harm, there's no 911. You're going to have to take care of that yourself. But just no neighbors, no friends, nobody to socialize with. Very occasionally, people might find a way to get together, but that's going to be a problem. One more thing about isolation specific to the women. There's a fear that never really quite's nagging at you, and that is, what if you get pregnant? The time's going to come when that baby's going to want out. Is your husband an obstetrician? So either he or maybe an older child is going to have to figure a way to get this done. And if If there's a complication, you can guess the rest. All this added up, and somebody along the way figured out, I don't know what they based it on, that approximately 1 out of every 5 Great Plains frontier wives eventually went certifiably insane. Now, there were strong women who welcomed the challenge, or at least they claimed to, but this is tough. Nobody to socialize with, bugs everywhere, fear. It's going to get to you. Your world is that sod hut and the wood stove, and striving all the time to lay out ideally 3 square meals a day for your family from scratch, and you don't really have a whole lot of scratch to work with. So, as I told you up front, most of these people gave it up after a while. 2 years, 3 years, this isn't working. So they maybe sell their claim to somebody else and just pick up and move, leaving behind, in some cases, many cases, poorly marked graves where their children or perhaps a spouse would lie. This is a rough time, okay? Those are some tough people. So that will do it for farming on the Great Plains. It gets better. By the 1890s, you got windmills, you got, houses, 2-story houses with gingerbread trim, probably a telephone, stuff like that. And I guess the final irony, the day would come and say the 1920s, when American agriculture is in depression before the rest of the economy was, the only farmers in the whole United States who were in the black, who were making money, were Great Plains farmers. For some of them, their parents or grandparents stuffing it out in the Saudi for a few years had paid off. So I'm going to cap this one off now. And the topic for the basically Wednesday, Thursday will be various parts of a long and rambling topic, which I call America in the Gilded Age. See you later.